I'd been a park ranger for nearly a decade, but nothing prepared me for that thundersplit night in Cedarwood Forest. The storm had been rolling in all afternoon, heavy clouds pregnant with rain, wind rattling my cabin windows like impatient spirits. Each gust seemed to carry whispers, though I told myself it was just the ancient pines groaning under the pressure. The barometer had been dropping for hours, and my old war wound in my left knee throbbed with each atmospheric shift, a reliable predictor of the tempest to come. I was wrapping up the day's patrol notes when the radio crackled. Static filled the small cabin, punctuated by bursts of panicked chatter from other stations. Then came the call that made my blood freeze. "Rangers to base, hikers overdue on Old Pine Trail." The dispatcher's voice trembled, half with static, half with unease. I recognized that tone. I'd heard it only twice before in my career, both times before we found bodies. My blood ran cold. That trail was no joke. Twisted roots that caught ankles in the dark, steep drop-offs hidden by decades of fallen pine needles, and if you lost the path, you'd be swallowed by pine and shadow. The trail had claimed 3 lives in the past 15 years, all during storms like this one. The locals avoided it after sunset, crossing themselves when they spoke its name. Even the wildlife seemed to steer clear of certain sections, as if some primal instinct warned them away. By the time I hit the forest floor, rain pounded the ground like a million tiny hammers. The parking area at the trailhead was empty except for a single sedan, a blue Honda with mud-splattered license plates and a child's booster seat in the back. The sight of that small seat sent ice through my veins. My breath misted in the suddenly frigid air, and I noticed my hands were already shaking as I checked my gear one final time. The beam of my flashlight cut through the downpour, illuminating raindrops that glittered like shards of glass, each one seeming to hang suspended for an impossible moment before gravity reclaimed it. The darkness beyond my light seemed to pulse with malevolent life. I called out into the darkness, voice swallowed instantly by the wind. "Hikers! This is Ranger Jacobs. If you can hear me, shout back!" The words left my throat raw, but only silence answered, a silence so complete it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. My heart hammered in my chest as I stepped onto the muddy trail. Every footfall squelched in the mud, releasing the rich, loamy scent of decay. Old Pine Trail was notorious for its narrow ridges and leaning pines carved by decades of storms, trees bent so far they nearly touched the earth, their branches forming natural archways that felt like walking through the ribcage of some massive, long-dead beast. I paused at the last known waypoint, checking my GPS. No signal. The screen flickered, showing only static where the satellite connection should be. Great. I flipped open my map and compass, forcing myself to breathe evenly despite the growing pressure in my chest. The compass needle spun wildly for a moment before settling on magnetic north, or what I hoped was north. In storms like this, even reliable instruments could fail. I took my first steps into the forest's throat, where darkness pooled deeper than the night sky. The wind whispered through the pine needles, a susurrus that sounded eerily like voices, weak, pleading, blurred by the rain. My mind fought to stay rational. It's just the rain in the branches, just the natural acoustics of the forest. Yet something tugged at the edge of my senses, a prickle crawling up my spine like ice-cold fingers tracing my vertebrae. I rounded a bend and saw it, fresh footprints in the mud. 2 sets, adult and child. They trailed off toward a cluster of ancient pines, gnarled and twisted like arthritic fingers reaching up to claw at the storm clouds. My breath caught in my throat, forming a small cloud that dissipated into the rain. The footprints were filling with water, but they couldn't have been more than an hour old. I followed. The footprints led me deeper than I'd ever gone on this trail, past landmarks I'd memorized and into territory that felt fundamentally wrong. The trees here grew differently, too close together, their trunks twisted in spirals that hurt to look at directly. Rainwater pooled in hollows, reflecting not the stormy sky above but something darker, more primordial. The panic fluttered in my chest like a caged bird desperate to escape. My flashlight beam danced across fallen logs and tangled undergrowth, each shadow seeming to writhe and shift when caught in my peripheral vision. The rain had washed away most scents, but underneath the clean smell of petrichor lurked something else, something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in a tomb. Every shadow seemed to shift, and I found myself spinning at sounds that weren't there, jumping at movements that resolved into nothing more than rain-heavy branches swaying in the wind. I called again, louder this time, my voice cracking with desperation. "Mia! Lucas! Answer me!" The dispatcher had given me their names during my rushed briefing: Mia, 34, a nature photographer from the city, and her 7-year-old son Lucas, who'd apparently begged his mother to take him camping despite the weather warnings. The thought of that child, small and frightened in this nightmare landscape, made my chest tighten until I could barely breathe. My voice echoed back strangely, as if the forest was mocking me, repeating my words in a pitch just slightly wrong, just disturbing enough to make my skin crawl. The echoes seemed to linger too long, bouncing between the trees in impossible patterns that defied the laws of acoustics I'd learned in my forestry training. Ahead, the trees parted into a clearing that shouldn't have existed. No clearing this size appeared on any of my maps. Broken camping gear lay scattered across the muddy ground like the aftermath of a violent struggle. An overturned backpack with its contents spilled into the mud, a half-crushed water bottle still bearing the bite marks of small teeth, muddy footprints leading away in 3 different directions. The sight made my stomach lurch with sick recognition. I'd seen crime scenes that looked cleaner than this. I knelt, heart thudding against my ribs as I examined the evidence more closely. My hand shook as I lifted a small purple jacket, child-sized, torn along one seam. The child's footprint looked smaller than I'd expected from the dispatcher's description, almost unnaturally tiny, as if Lucas had somehow shrunk, or something else entirely had made those tracks. The impression in the mud was too deep for such a small foot, as if whatever had made it weighed far more than any 7-year-old should. My skin tingled with the electricity that comes before lightning strikes, but there was no flash, no thunder, just that crawling sensation of being watched by something that understood exactly how vulnerable I was. The trees around the clearing leaned inward, their branches forming a natural amphitheater that seemed designed to trap sound, to prevent anything from escaping. A low groan drifted through the trees, carried on the wind like a message from the damned. I froze, every muscle in my body coiled tight as piano wire, scanning the perimeter of the clearing with methodical precision. The sound was animalistic, like a wounded deer, but lower, more guttural, with an undertone that spoke of intelligence and malice. It was the sound of something that had once been human but had forgotten what humanity meant. My training kicked in with mechanical precision. Draw your sidearm, stay on high ground, never show fear to a predator. I thumbed my flashlight onto strobe, hoping to disorient whatever was watching me from the shadows. The strobing light turned the forest into a series of frozen tableaus, each flash revealing the clearing in stark black and white, shadows jumping and dancing like demons at a midnight ball. The groan echoed again, closer this time, and I could hear the wet sound of something large moving through the undergrowth, branches snapping under considerable weight. My mouth went dry as old leather, and I had to consciously force myself not to hyperventilate. The sound was circling the clearing, testing me, looking for weakness. Then I saw movement. Between 2 massive pines something shifted, a hunched silhouette that defied easy categorization. The limbs were too long for a human, jointed in ways that made my eyes water to follow their movement. The head jerked unnaturally, tilting at angles that should have snapped vertebrae. In the strobing light, I caught glimpses of pale flesh stretched tight over prominent bones, and when it moved, I heard the wet sound of joints grinding against each other without the cushion of proper cartilage. My heart lurched, and I felt my vision tunnel as adrenaline flooded my system. I fired one flare into the canopy, the projectile hissing upward in a brilliant arc of red phosphorus. The blaze illuminated the forest in hellish detail, casting everything in shades of blood and shadow. For one terrible instant, I saw it clearly, a face pale and gaunt as a famine victim, but the eyes reflected orange light like an animal's, pupils dilated wide with hunger or madness or both. It stood on 2 legs but crouched like an ape, its spine curved in a question mark of predatory readiness. Its jaws parted with a wet sound, revealing rows of uneven teeth, some human straight, others curved like fangs, all of them stained dark with substances I didn't want to identify. When it breathed, I could see its ribs pushing against skin so thin it was almost translucent. I dropped to one knee, fighting to keep my voice steady despite the terror that threatened to shatter my composure like glass. "Stay back!" I leveled my flashlight at the creature, using it like a weapon, like a shield against the darkness it embodied. The LED beams seemed pitifully small against the vast malevolence radiating from those orange eyes. The creature halted, tilting its head as if curious about this strange, frightened animal that dared to make demands. For a moment that stretched like eternity, we regarded each other across the clearing, predator and prey, darkness and light, something that had once been human and something that still clung desperately to humanity. Then it bolted, crashing into the underbrush with the sound of a small avalanche. Small trees snapped like twigs under its passage, and I heard the wet thud of its feet hitting the ground with each bounding stride. The sound faded quickly, but I knew it hadn't gone far. Creatures like that didn't retreat, they repositioned. My radio erupted with static and panicked voices. "Rangers, base, any sign of them? Over." I fumbled for my mic with numb fingers, nearly dropping it in the mud. I saw something. It's not human." My voice sounded alien to my own ears, high and thin with barely controlled hysteria. Static swallowed my words, and I wasn't sure if anyone had heard me or if they'd simply dismissed my report as storm-induced panic. I tried again, but the radio remained stubbornly silent, leaving me alone with the sound of rain and my own ragged breathing. I chased after the creature, adrenaline pushing me through the mud and thorns that grabbed at my uniform like grasping hands. Every step felt like a betrayal of survival instinct, but those missing hikers, especially little Lucas, drove me forward despite my terror. Branches whipped at my face, leaving thin cuts that stung in the cold rain. My vision blurred with water and blood, but I pressed on, following the trail of destruction the creature had left in its wake. The trail ended abruptly at a cliffside overlook that plunged into darkness so complete my flashlight beam couldn't find the bottom. Below, the forest stretched into infinity, a sea of pine shadows that seemed to move with purpose, as if the trees themselves were walking through the night. The wind howled up from the depths, carrying sounds that might have been voices or might have been the screaming of tortured wood. No sign of the hikers anywhere, just that vast expanse of hostile wilderness that had swallowed them without a trace. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my temples, and hatred flared at my own self-doubt and inadequacy. I was the ranger. I was supposed to know these woods, supposed to protect the people who trusted the Park Service to keep them safe. I had failed these people, failed that little boy who was probably huddled somewhere in the dark, calling for his mother while something inhuman stalked through the trees. I climbed down a narrow ledge, my fingers bleeding on wet rock that seemed to cut like broken glass. Every slip felt potentially fatal, the darkness below ready to swallow me like the maw of some great beast. The cliff face was slick with rain and what felt like moss, but when I touched it, the texture was wrong, too soft, too warm, like skin that had been underwater too long. At the bottom, a narrow game path led deeper into the valley, winding between trees that grew so close together their branches formed a tunnel overhead. I followed, calling until my throat burned, my voice growing hoarse and desperate. The path seemed to shift under my feet, as if the forest was subtly changing its layout, leading me deeper into its heart where rescue would be impossible. Suddenly, a child's scream ricocheted off the trees, high, terrified, unmistakably human. The sound hit me like a physical blow, and I spun toward it, rushing forward with renewed desperation. The scream died as abruptly as it had come, cut off in a way that made my blood freeze. I stumbled into another clearing, this one ringed with petrified pines that looked more like pillars of bone than wood. At the center lay a circle of stones, each one stained black with substances that gleamed wetly in my flashlight beam. The footprints I'd been following ended here, as if the hikers had simply vanished into thin air. The stones were arranged with deliberate precision, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometries that suggested purpose and intelligence, and rituals older than human memory. I swallowed hard, tasting copper and fear. "Mia?" Lucas? My voice cracked like a teenager's. I stepped forward, and the branches overhead shuddered despite the absence of wind. Then, softly, barely audible over the rain, came a whisper like dead leaves brushing against tombstones. Help! My flashlight flickered, the beam stuttering like a dying heartbeat. My own heart seized in response, as if the failing light was connected to my life force by some invisible thread. The whisper came again, closer now, seeming to emanate from all directions at once, from the trees, from the stones, from the very air around me. The sound wrapped around my skull like cold fingers, penetrating bone and brain matter until I could feel it vibrating in my teeth. I spun in a slow circle, the light beam slicing through the gloom in desperate arcs, illuminating nothing but rain and shadow and the watching presence of those bone-white trees. The whisper resolved gradually into something more distinct, a plaintive sob that was unmistakably human, terrified, and heartbreakingly young. The sound of a child lost in the dark, calling for help that might never come. I forced my feet toward the sound, each step requiring conscious effort as if I were walking through deep water or against a strong current. The air itself seemed to thicken with malevolent intent, pressing against me from all sides like a physical weight. But as I crossed the blackened stone circle, something fundamental shifted in the world around me. The trees bent inward, their branches interweaving overhead to form a tunnel of living wood. The rain stopped falling, not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had thrown a switch. The wind died to absolute stillness, leaving a silence so complete that my ears began to ring with phantom sound. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds, and I could see my breath forming clouds that dissipated too quickly in the motionless air. I realized with a cold stab of dread that traveled from my chest to the tips of my fingers that I might be the next voice trapped in these woods, another whisper calling futilely for help that would never arrive. The thought should have paralyzed me with terror, but instead it filled me with a strange, fatalistic calm. I reached a fallen oak, its massive trunk split like a cracked skull, the wood inside white as exposed bone. The tree must have been ancient when it fell, easily 200 years old, maybe more. Nestled in its gnarled roots, protected from the rain by a natural canopy of bark and debris, was a battered journal wrapped in oiled leather. The binding was old but well maintained, and my hands shook as I lifted it free from its resting place. The pages were damp but legible, covered in handwriting that varied from entry to entry, different pens, different pressures, different levels of desperation. I flipped it open to a random page and began to read, ranger logs dating back decades, entries describing the same footprints I'd been following, the same whispers I'd been hearing, the same missing hikers who vanished into the forest's hungry darkness. Each entry told a familiar story, searches that led nowhere, evidence that disappeared, sounds that couldn't be explained by natural phenomena. The dates spanned 40 years, written by rangers whose names I recognized from memorial plaques back at the station. Men and women who died in service, whose bodies had been found days or weeks later, sometimes never found at all. But it was the most recent entries that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. One log ended mid-sentence, the handwriting becoming increasingly erratic. "They're in the trees with me. I can hear them moving in the branches. Something's coming down and I can't. They're not. Don't come looking for." The pen had torn through the paper at that point, leaving gouges in the pages beneath. But it was the handwriting I recognized that made my vision blur and my knees buckle. The careful block letters, the way the G's curved just slightly to the left, the distinctive cross on the T's, it was mine. But I'd never written these words, never been to this clearing before tonight, never seen this journal in my life. A flood of memories crashed over me like a physical tide, each one hitting with the force of revelation and the pain of suppressed trauma. Nights of insomnia that stretched back months, maybe years, nights when I'd wake in cold sweats with the taste of pine sap in my mouth and the sound of whispers echoing in my ears. Nightmares of trees that moved when I wasn't looking, of voices calling my name from deep in the forest, of my own voice screaming for help while something unseen circled in the darkness just beyond my vision. The memories kept coming, older now, buried under decades of deliberate forgetting. Childhood trauma I'd spent a fortune in therapy trying to process. My twin sister Emily, 7 years old and fearless, vanishing in these same woods 30 years ago during a family camping trip. The search that lasted weeks, involving hundreds of volunteers and every piece of equipment the Park Service could mobilize. My father's accusations, spoken in moments of grief-fueled rage, that I should have watched her, should have kept her close, that it was my fault she'd wandered off while I was distracted by a deer that had seemed to beckon me deeper into the trees. They'd searched until the first snow fell, but found only her locket, a small silver heart she'd worn every day since our 6th birthday. I'd blocked it out, convinced myself the memories were nightmares, spent years in therapy learning to cope with survivor's guilt that felt like carrying a stone in my chest. But now, holding this impossible journal in hands that shook with recognition, I knew the truth I'd been hiding from myself. As the journal fell from my numb fingers and hit the muddy ground with a wet slap, I realized with crystalline clarity what I was dealing with. The forest wasn't just haunted by the spirits of the lost, it was something far worse. It was sentient, aware, hungry for the specific flavor of human despair that came from loss and guilt, and the terrible knowledge that you'd failed to save someone you loved. It fed on that guilt, nurtured it, used it to create echoes of the missing that lived in the spaces between the trees. These weren't ghosts in any traditional sense. They were constructs, phantoms built from grief and regret and the forest's own malevolent intelligence. They existed in the shadows between thought and reality, sustained by the anguish of those left behind. And I had been coming here for years, drawn by dreams I couldn't remember and compulsions I couldn't explain. Coming to feed the forest with my guilt over Emily, my desperate need to find her, to save her, to undo 30 years of self-recrimination. Each visit had made it stronger, more real, more capable of reaching into the world beyond its borders to claim new victims. The wind roared back without warning, carrying the scent of pine and decay and something else, something that smelled like childhood summers and innocence lost, and the particular sadness that comes from toys left behind in empty rooms. The journal's pages fluttered in the sudden gust, revealing one final entry written in my own hand but in words I'd never consciously formed. The forest demands a life for every life it takes. I understand now. I am its offering, just as she was. Just as they all were. The ink glistened wetly despite the age of the paper, as if the words had been written in something more substantial than mere ink. As if they'd been written in promise, in blood, in the currency the forest preferred above all others. I slammed my flashlight into my belt and drew my pistol with hands that barely obeyed my conscious will, though some deep part of my mind already knew that the creature stalking these woods had moved beyond the reach of conventional weapons. The metal felt cold and inadequate against my palm, a child's toy brought to fight a nightmare that existed in the spaces between what was real and what was possible. The whispering returned with renewed intensity, no longer the single plaintive voice I'd heard before but a cacophony of sounds that rattled the very foundations of my sanity. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, speaking in languages I'd never heard and in words that predated human speech. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the trees themselves, from the stones beneath my feet, from the spaces between raindrops that hung suspended in the dead air. Branches whipped around me as if moved by their own volition, no longer merely swaying in the wind but reaching out with deliberate intent, forming shapes that my mind tried desperately not to recognize. Faces twisted in agony, hands reaching out in supplication, figures that might once have been human but had been stretched and distorted by years of existing in the forest's hungry embrace. I fired a warning shot into the canopy, the gunshot impossibly loud in the supernatural silence. The bullet struck bark and wood exploded in a shower of splinters, but instead of the clean white wood I expected to see, the interior of the tree pulsed red and wet, like exposed muscle. The faces formed by the branches recoiled from the sound, but they didn't disappear. They simply retreated to the edges of my vision, waiting for their moment to strike. I backed toward the path, but the forest had other plans. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift and flow like water, and every step I took led me in directions I hadn't chosen. Suddenly I found myself standing at the cliff's edge again, though I was certain I'd been moving away from it moments before. The sensation was like being caught in a nightmare where running only takes you back to the thing you're trying to escape. Below, lightning that had no source illuminated a figure standing in the clearing I'd left behind, a little girl, pale as moonlight, her clothes torn and muddied but recognizably from 3 decades past. She raised one small hand toward me, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the impossible distance with perfect clarity. "Ranger," she whispered, and I heard my sister's voice for the first time in 30 years. "Help me!" The words hit me like a physical blow, and grief twisted in my gut with the sharp pain of a knife between ribs. All the therapy, all the healing, all the careful construction of a life built around protecting others instead of dwelling on the one I'd failed to protect, it all crumbled in that instant. I was 7 years old again, watching my twin sister walk into the trees because I'd been too distracted by something I couldn't even remember now to keep her safe. I climbed down the cliff face, no longer caring about the cuts that opened on my hands or the way loose stones tumbled into the darkness below. The branches that had seemed threatening moments before now seemed to be trying to help, offering handholds and footholds that made the descent possible despite my shaking limbs and blurred vision. They whispered encouragement in Emily's voice, telling me to hurry, that she'd been waiting so long, that she knew I'd come for her eventually. As I reached the clearing, Emily raised both hands toward me, and I could see she was crying, tears that caught the impossible light and reflected it back in colors that didn't exist in the natural world. Behind her, moving with the fluid grace of something that had never been entirely human, emerged the creature I'd seen before. But now I could see it clearly, and the recognition nearly drove me to my knees. It was me, or what I might become if I stayed in these woods long enough. My face, but stretched and distorted by hunger and isolation and the forest's transformative power. My body, but elongated and twisted into something designed for hunting through the spaces between trees. My eyes, but reflecting a light that came from sources older and more terrible than any sun. The creature that was me opened jaws that had too many teeth and spoke in my own voice, but layered with harmonics that made my bones ache. "She's waiting for you. She's been waiting for so long. All you have to do is let go." I grasped Emily's arm, feeling flesh that was real and solid and heartbreakingly fragile. "It's okay," I whispered, pulling her toward me with desperate gentleness. "I've got you now. I'm sorry I let you go. I'm sorry I wasn't watching." She smiled up at me with the same gap-toothed grin I remembered from childhood photos, but as I lifted her small form, she began to dissolve into mist that felt like touching memories made manifest. Her weight became insubstantial, her warmth faded, and I was left holding nothing but the echo of what might have been forgiveness. The creature lunged in that same instant, moving with speed that defied the laws of physics. I fired without conscious thought, muscle memory from years of training taking over when conscious decision became impossible. The bullet should have struck center mass, should have dropped anything made of flesh and blood, but instead it struck the trunk of an ancient pine that stood where the creature had been a microsecond before. The tree exploded as if struck by lightning, bark and wood and something that pulsed with its own sick light scattering in all directions. In the heartwood, revealed like a tumor in the center of a cancer, was a knot that glowed with bioluminescent fury. For one instant, I saw patterns in that light, geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly, symbols that seemed to move when I wasn't looking straight at them, designs that spoke of intelligence and hunger, and things that had been old when the first trees took root in primordial soil. Then my second shot shattered the knot completely, and the creature that wore my face screamed with a sound like 1,000 trees falling at once. It collapsed into itself, flesh becoming sawdust, becoming nothing more than a pile of organic matter that the rain immediately began to wash away. The forest fell silent in a way that felt different from the supernatural quiet of moments before. This was natural silence, the simple absence of sound that came when the wind died and the rain stopped and the world held its breath in the moment between one weather pattern and the next. The mist that had been Emily burned away like morning fog touched by sunlight, leaving behind only the clean smell of rain-washed pine and earth. Above us, the canopy parted for the first time since I'd entered the clearing, revealing patches of star-scattered sky. Moonlight glittered on wet pine needles like scattered diamonds, and I could hear the natural sounds of the forest returning, the drip of water from branch to branch, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, the distant call of a night bird that sounded like hope made audible. In the clearing where the stone circle had been, I found them, Mia and Lucas, unconscious but breathing, curled together under the shelter of a fallen log. Lucas's small chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm of healthy sleep, and his mother's arms were wrapped protectively around him even in unconsciousness. They were muddy and cold, but alive, gloriously, impossibly alive. I radioed for medevac, and this time the signal went through clearly, my words reaching the dispatcher with crystalline clarity. Within an hour, the forest was filled with the sound of rescue helicopters and search teams, their lights cutting through the darkness like swords of hope. Hours later, safe in the warmth and artificial light of the ranger station, I sat at my desk staring at the official incident report I was supposed to file. How do you explain the unexplainable? How do you document an encounter with something that existed in the spaces between reality and nightmare? The form had neat little boxes for weather conditions, and terrain difficulty, and contributing factors, but no space for confronted the manifestation of childhood trauma given malevolent life by a sentient forest. Instead, I wrote the sanitized version. Hikers located after extended search in severe weather conditions. Subjects found unconscious but uninjured, suffering from mild hypothermia and exposure. Recommend increased warning signage on Old Pine Trail and consideration of temporary closure during severe weather events. The words felt like lies, but they were the kind of lies that let people sleep at night, the kind that kept the Park Service funded and tourists visiting and the world spinning on its axis. But in the margin of that official report, where only I would see it, I wrote the truth. The forest remembers every lost soul. Today I learned that some hauntings are not about the dead refusing to rest, but about the living refusing to forgive themselves. Mia and Lucas had been released from the hospital that morning, physically unharmed but with no memory of how they'd ended up in that clearing. Lucas had asked his mother if they could go camping again sometime, maybe somewhere with fewer trees, and she'd laughed and promised him a beach vacation instead. They'd driven away in their blue Honda, alive and whole and blissfully ignorant of how close they'd come to becoming just another entry in the park's missing persons files. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out something I'd been carrying for 30 years, Emily's silver locket, returned to me by the search team that had found it in the mud near her last known location. I'd kept it close ever since, a talisman of guilt that I wore like a hair shirt, a daily reminder of my failure to protect the person who mattered most. The locket was tarnished now, green with age and exposure, but when I opened it, the tiny photos inside were still clear, me and Emily at age 6, gap-toothed and grinning, arms around each other in the way that only twins can manage. For 30 years, I looked at those photos and seen accusation. Tonight, for the first time, I saw love. I understood now what the forest had been feeding on, not just guilt, but the particular poison of unprocessed grief, the way trauma could metastasize if you kept it hidden in the dark places of your mind. The creature that had worn my face had been everything I might become if I let that guilt consume me completely. Twisted, hungry, eternally stalking through the spaces between what was real and what might have been. But Emily was gone, had been gone for 30 years, and no amount of self-recrimination would bring her back. What I could do, what I had done, was save the living. Mia and Lucas went home because I'd been there, because I'd faced the darkness and found the strength to shoot back. That had to be enough. That had to be the meaning I built from the ashes of childhood loss. I wrote a new entry in my personal log, the real record I kept of the things that happened in these woods. Today I faced the forest hunger and learned that it feeds on guilt transformed into self-destruction. I saved 2 lives, but more importantly, I saved my own. Emily's ghost doesn't call from the pines anymore, not because she's been laid to rest, but because I've finally learned to forgive myself for being 7 years old and fallible and human. I closed the locket and slipped it into my pocket, but for the first time in decades, it felt like a comfort rather than a weight. Tomorrow I would put in for a transfer, maybe to one of the desert parks, somewhere the trees couldn't whisper and the shadows couldn't take the shapes of lost children. It was time to start a new chapter in a place where the past couldn't follow. But even as I made plans to leave, part of me knew I'd be back someday. The forest would call to others carrying guilt and trauma and unhealed wounds, and there would be more MIAs and Lucases who needed someone to stand between them and the darkness. When that happened, I'd be ready. I locked the station and walked out into the pre-dawn darkness, where the first hints of sunrise were painting the eastern sky the color of hope. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind air so clear and clean it felt like breathing for the first time in years. In the distance, I could see the tree line where Old Pine Trail disappeared into shadow, but the malevolent presence I'd felt there for so long was finally quiet. As I drove home through the winding mountain roads, I rolled down the windows and let the forest air fill the car. It smelled like rain and earth and growing things, like life persisting in the face of darkness, like morning coming no matter how long the night had been. Somewhere in those trees, Emily's memory rested peacefully at last, not trapped between worlds but simply part of the natural cycle of life and death and renewal that had been playing out in forests since time began. She was 7 years old forever in my heart, but she was also free from the guilt that had kept her tethered to my pain, free to be what the dead should be, a cherished memory rather than an unhealed wound. I promised myself that next time the forest called, because there would be a next time, there always was, I'd answer not as a man haunted by guilt, but as someone who understood the difference between protecting the living and trying to resurrect the dead. The sun broke the horizon as I pulled into my driveway, painting the world in shades of gold and possibility. I sat in the car for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, watching the light chase away the last shadows of night. For the first time in 30 years, I wasn't afraid of what might be hiding in those shadows. I went inside and made coffee, real coffee instead of the instant stuff I usually drank in my rush to get to work. I sat at my kitchen table and watched the sun climb higher, listening to the ordinary sounds of morning, birds singing, neighbors starting their cars, life continuing its ancient rhythm of renewal and hope. On the table in front of me lay the transfer paperwork I'd been putting off for months. Desert parks, they said. Places where the biggest danger was rattlesnakes and heat stroke, where the landscape was too harsh and open for ancient hungers to take root and grow. Places where a man could start over, could learn to be someone other than the ranger who'd lost his sister and spent 3 decades trying to find her in the faces of every missing person who wandered into his woods. But as I reached for the pen, my hand stopped. Outside my window, I could see the tree line in the distance, peaceful now in the morning light. Old Pine Trail wound through those trees, and while the particular malevolence I'd faced last night was gone, the forest itself remained, vast, indifferent, beautiful, and occasionally hungry for the unwary. There would be other hikers, other families who didn't heed weather warnings or who simply had bad luck and worse timing. There would be other searchers, other rangers who might not understand what they were truly facing when they went into those woods looking for the lost. I put the pen down and looked at Emily's locket, lying open on the table where it caught and reflected the morning sun. In the photos, we were laughing about something I couldn't remember now, but the joy was real and permanent, captured forever in silver and light. "What do you think, Em?" I asked the empty kitchen. "Should I stay and keep an eye on things? Make sure the next guy knows what he's getting into?" The silence that answered wasn't the supernatural quiet of the haunted forest, but the natural pause of morning settling into day. And in that silence, I found my answer. I closed the transfer papers and filed them away in a drawer I probably wouldn't open again. Then I opened my laptop and began to type a different kind of document, a guide for future rangers, a manual for dealing with the things that couldn't be put in official reports. A way to pass on what I'd learned without sounding like a man or ending up in mandatory psychological evaluation. I called it Unusual Incident Response Protocols for Cedarwood Forest, and made it sound as bureaucratic and boring as possible. But between the lines of official language about weather-related disorientation and terrain-induced psychological stress, I embedded the real information, what to look for, how to recognize when a search and rescue had become something else entirely, and most importantly, how to face the darkness without becoming part of it. The next ranger who walked Old Pine Trail would have a fighting chance, even if they never realized why the manual emphasized certain seemingly random precautions. They know to trust their instincts when the forest felt wrong, to carry flares as well as flashlights, and to never, ever follow phantom voices into clearings that didn't appear on any map. By the time I finished writing, the sun was high and warm, and my coffee had long since gone cold. I saved the document, and made copies, one for the official files, one for my desk drawer, and one for my home safe. Insurance against forgetting, against the human tendency to rationalize away experiences that didn't fit into comfortable categories. I looked at the locket one more time, then closed it gently and slipped it into my pocket. Not as a weight of guilt this time, but as a reminder of why the work mattered. Emily was gone, but Mia and Lucas were alive. That equation would have to balance the books. The phone rang, dispatch calling with the day's assignments. Routine patrols, maintenance checks on trail markers, a group of college students who needed permits for a weekend camping trip. Normal ranger work, the kind that kept parks safe and visitors happy and bureaucrats satisfied with their statistics. "Ranger Jacobs," I answered, and for the first time in years, my voice didn't catch on my own name. "Morning, Jake. Got a quiet day planned for you. Just the usual rounds, unless something comes up." I looked out the window toward the trees, where Old Pine Trail wound through shadows that held only ordinary darkness now. The forest was still there, still watching, still waiting for the next person who carried enough guilt and pain to feed its ancient hunger. But now I understood what I was really protecting people from, not just the physical dangers of wilderness, but the way untreated trauma could manifest as something far worse than mere memory. "Copy that," I told dispatch. "I'll be ready for whatever comes up." And I would be. The forest had taught me that some battles couldn't be won by running away, that some responsibilities couldn't be transferred to someone else. I was the ranger who knew the real dangers of these woods, and that made me the only one qualified to stand watch. I finished getting ready for work, checked my gear one final time, and headed out into a day bright with possibility and shadowed with purpose. Behind me, Emily's memory rested peacefully in silver and light. Ahead of me, the forest waited with the patience of something that had learned to measure time in centuries rather than moments. But I was no longer afraid. I had faced the worst the darkness could offer and learned that sometimes the only way to defeat a monster is to refuse to become one yourself. Sometimes salvation comes not from finding the dead, but from protecting the living. Sometimes healing means accepting that some wounds leave scars, and scars can be marks of survival rather than failure. The trees whispered as I drove past, but now I heard only wind and pine needles, only the natural music of a forest going about its ancient business of growing and changing and enduring. The whispers that had once called my name in Emily's voice were finally silent, not because the forest had forgotten, but because I had finally learned to remember without drowning in the past. Old Pine Trail still wound through those woods, still claimed the unwary and the unprepared. But now it had a guardian who understood its true nature, someone who could face the darkness without flinching because he'd already walked through his own. The morning stretched ahead, full of ordinary mysteries and routine miracles. Somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled with the daily business of keeping people safe. And in the trees, ancient shadows waited with the patience of stone, knowing that sooner or later, another lost soul would come seeking what could never be found. But when that happened, they wouldn't be alone in the dark. They'd have a ranger who understood the difference between being haunted and being healed, between carrying guilt and carrying hope. The forest would always be hungry. But now it had someone watching who understood exactly what it was trying to feed on, and why that hunger had to be stopped before it could consume another generation of the lost and the searching and the guilty. The whispers in the pines had finally fallen silent, but the watch continued. I never believed in ghost stories, until the night I found the Lost Cabin Trail sign half buried in mud and ivy. Pine Ridge Park was my domain, every path, every ravine, every creaking tree. I'd walked these trails for 7 years, memorized every bend and hollow, catalogued every fallen log and seasonal stream. But that sign, it shouldn't have existed. The Fowler family disappeared here 40 years ago, and the trail was officially decommissioned, its markers removed, its path left to be reclaimed by the wilderness. Yet there it was, pointing into darkness, the wood weathered but somehow preserved, the carved letters still legible despite decades of exposure. My fingers traced the rough-hewn words. Lost Cabin Trail 2.3 miles. The paint in the grooves looked fresh, as if someone had recently filled them in with careful, deliberate strokes. The rain had just stopped, but the air still hung heavy with mist that clung to my uniform and beaded on my flashlight lens. I held my torch close, its beams slicing through the haze like a blade cutting silk. My breath came in ragged puffs that mingled with the fog, each exhalation visible in the sudden drop in temperature. The storm had left everything saturated. The ground beneath my boots squelched with each step, and water dripped from pine needles in a steady percussion that masked other sounds. A cold wind rustled the pines, carrying something that made my blood freeze, a faint sob, almost imperceptible, like a child's cry carried on the breeze. The sound seemed to weave between the tree trunks, circling me with an intimacy that raised every hair on my arms. I froze, my hand instinctively moving to my radio. "Hello?" My voice echoed between the trunks, bouncing back with a hollow quality that made it sound foreign to my own ears. The word seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, as if the forest was reluctant to let it go. Nothing replied, only the distant drip of water from branch to forest floor and that faint sobbing that seemed to circle me, growing no louder but somehow more insistent, more desperate. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dried despite the humid air. My boots sank deeper into the damp earth as I stepped forward, mud clinging to my soles with each labored step. Every ranger knows fear is just a product of your mind, a survival mechanism gone haywire when faced with the unknown. But this felt different. Personal. Familiar, like a half-remembered nightmare from childhood. A torn piece of canvas snagged on a low branch caught my attention, a camping tent flap, bright blue fabric that stood out against the muted browns and greens of the forest. I tugged it free, feeling the material between my fingers. The tear was fresh, the edges still sharp and clean. And there, darkening the blue fabric, was what looked unmistakably like blood, not old and brown, but still red enough to catch the light from my torch. My pulse quickened as I raised my torch higher, sweeping the beam across the immediate area. The light landed on something that made my stomach drop, a blood-stained map pinned beneath a heavy rock, held down against the wind and weather. The map was hand-drawn but detailed, showing the terrain of this forgotten section of the park. The lost cabin itself was marked with an ominous X, surrounded by smaller markings that looked like graves. My pulse thundered in my ears as I glanced at my radio, pressing the call button with a thumb that trembled slightly. "Jackson Base, this is Ranger Ellis. I've found evidence, possible victims. Requesting backup, over." Static crackled through the speaker, the white noise seeming unnaturally loud in the hushed forest. I waited, counting seconds that stretched into eternity. No answer came, just the endless static that seemed to mock my isolation. I rolled my shoulders, forcing calm into my tense muscles. Backup or not, I had a job to do. People might be hurt, might be counting on me. I studied the map more carefully, noting the careful notation of landmarks and the precise directions marked in what looked like a child's handwriting. Following the map's direction, I pushed deeper into the campground's abandoned heart, where civilization had surrendered to the wild decades ago. Mud soaked through my boots as I pushed deeper into the forgotten reaches of the park, each step taking me further from the maintained trails and closer to something that felt increasingly wrong. The beam of my torch wavered as my hand trembled slightly, illuminating a scene that looked like the aftermath of a hasty evacuation: overturned camping chairs with their fabric seats torn and flapping in the wind, shattered lantern glass that caught my light and threw it back in angry fragments, and scattered camping supplies that spoke of interrupted lives. The whispers started subtly, just the wind through pine needles at first, but gradually resolving into something that chilled me to the bone. Half-heard names drifted through the air. Emma. John. Each syllable felt like a dagger of ice sliding between my ribs, spoken in voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart hammered against my ribs as I knelt to examine fresh footprints pressed deep into the muddy path. The prints told a story I didn't want to read: adult boot prints, the kind made by hiking boots with deep treads, alongside smaller impressions that could only belong to a child. But there was something else, a third set of tracks that made my skin crawl. They were smaller than a child's, but wrong somehow, with a spacing and depth that suggested something that didn't walk quite like a human being. Branches groaned behind me with a sound like old bones cracking. I spun around, my torch beam sweeping across empty forests, but finding nothing but shadows that seemed to shift and dance just at the edge of my vision. The air itself felt different here, pressing against my skin like invisible hands with a weight and intention that spoke of presence, something watching, something waiting. Yet I pressed onward, clutching my flashlight against my chest like a talisman, my free hand resting on the grip of my service pistol. The familiar weight of the weapon was reassuring, even though some deep instinct told me it would be useless against whatever I was facing. Every ranger's mantra echoed through my mind like a prayer: stay calm, stay sharp, stay alive. The words had gotten me through dangerous wildlife encounters and emergency rescues, but they felt thin and inadequate now. The terrain began to change as I followed the hand-drawn map, sloping downward into a dell that felt older and more primal than the rest of the forest. Here, the trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to block out what little moonlight had been filtering through the canopy. The air grew thicker, pregnant with moisture and something else, the musty smell of decay and long abandonment. At the bottom of the dell, partially hidden behind a screen of overgrown ferns, I found what I was looking for, a cellar door set into what looked like a natural rise in the ground. The wooden planks were weathered gray but still solid, held together by iron hinges that had somehow resisted 4 decades of rust and rot. Beside the door, driven into the earth like a grave marker, stood a blood-spattered shovel. I approached the shovel with the careful steps of someone walking through a minefield. Its wooden handle was smooth with age and use, but the metal blade was dulled not just by rust but by something darker, stains that could have been dirt but looked too red, too intentional. I gripped the handle, and my instincts screamed warnings that my rational mind tried to dismiss. The cellar door resisted at first when I tried to pry it open, as if the earth itself was reluctant to give up its secrets. But eventually, the hinges gave way with a moan that sounded almost human, a sound of pain and reluctant surrender. The door fell back to reveal a staircase descending into pitch black, cut directly into the living rock and disappearing beyond the reach of my torch beam. The smell that rose from the opening was like nothing I'd ever encountered, not just the expected mustiness of an underground space, but something organic and wrong, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The air that flowed up from below was noticeably colder, carrying with it whispers of sound that might have been wind through stone passages or might have been something else entirely. "I'm coming," I whispered into the darkness, though I wasn't sure who I was addressing, the potential victims I was here to rescue, or the presence that seemed to be waiting for me in the depths below. I took my first step down, and the stone stair was immediately slick with moss and condensation that made each footfall treacherous. The descent felt endless, each step taking me deeper into the earth and further from the world I knew. My torch beam wavered and danced across walls of natural stone that had been carved and shaped by human hands, though the workmanship looked older than the 40-year-old Fowler disappearance, much older. Symbols and markings covered the walls, some carved deep into the rock, others painted in substances I didn't want to identify. Halfway down the staircase, I heard it, a lullaby, soft and tinkling like a child's music box, but wrong in every possible way. The melody was familiar, something from my own childhood, but it was played at the wrong speed, with notes that dragged and warped into something that raised goosebumps along my arms. The toy-like quality of the music made it even more disturbing, as if innocence itself had been corrupted and twisted into something malevolent. My stomach clenched as I recognized the tune. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," but played in a minor key and stretched out until each note became a groan of despair. Was this Emma's music box, the one her parents had mentioned in the missing persons report all those years ago? The one she'd carried everywhere, that played her favorite song to help her sleep? I reached the bottom of the staircase and found myself at the entrance to a cavernous chamber that defied the geology of the area. The space was too large, too perfectly formed to be natural, yet too organic to be entirely man-made. Ancient tree roots hung from the ceiling like the ribs of some primordial beast, dripping groundwater in a steady rhythm that echoed through the space like a heartbeat. The water collected in a shallow pool at the center of the chamber, its surface so still and dark it might have been black glass. But as I approached, torch held high, I saw movement beneath the surface. Something pale that might have been a reflection or might have been something else entirely. The water shimmered and began to clear, revealing something that made my blood turn to ice. A tiny arm, pale as moonlight, drifted just beneath the surface. Hair spread like seaweed in the dark water. And then, rising from the depths with movements that seemed to defy physics, a small figure broke the surface tension without causing so much as a ripple. I froze, my torch beam fixed on the impossible sight before me. A tiny voice, clear as crystal and cold as winter morning, called out from the pool. "Ranger, help me!" I dropped to my knees beside the pool, my uniform soaking through from the wet stone. The water continued to shimmer and clear, revealing more impossible details with each passing second. The little girl who stood waist-deep in the center looked exactly as she had in the missing persons photographs from 40 years ago, 7 years old, with long brown hair and wearing a blue dress with small white flowers embroidered along the collar. "I'm Emma," she whispered, and her voice carried perfectly across the chamber despite speaking barely above a whisper. Her eyes were enormous in her small face, but they held depths that no child's eyes should contain, depths that spoke of decades of waiting, of knowledge that should have been beyond her years. My breath caught in my throat as the full impossibility of what I was seeing crashed over me. Emma Fowler, the missing child whose disappearance had haunted this park for 4 decades, stood before me unchanged by the passage of time. "Emma," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and hollow in the cavernous space. "Can you tell me where John is?" She turned without a word, moving through the water with steps that barely seemed to touch the pool's bottom, and pointed toward a dark corridor that led deeper into the underground complex. I followed, my torch beam dancing off walls that seemed to pulse and breathe in the flickering light. The corridor was lined with ancient stones, but as we walked deeper, I began to notice something that made my skin crawl. Names. Dozens of names carved deep into the rock, each one scratched with tools that had left the bone-white letters stark against the dark stone. Some were obviously recent, the edges still sharp and clean. Others were weathered with age, worn smooth by decades or perhaps centuries of groundwater seepage. The names seemed to watch me as I passed, and I found myself reading them despite my growing dread. Sarah Mitchell, 1987. Thomas, 1995. The Morrison Family, 2003. The corridor opened into another chamber, and I realized with growing horror that this entire underground complex was a mausoleum of memories. Memories trapped in stone, preserved in the darkness like insects in amber. The air itself seemed thick with sorrow and desperation, pressing against me with the weight of accumulated grief and unfulfilled promises. Emma led me to the far end of this chamber, where an impossible sight awaited, the lost cabin itself, somehow transported underground and built directly into the living rock. Ivy crawled up its wooden walls with an organic vitality that defied the absence of sunlight, the leaves rustling with movements that might have been caused by underground air currents, or might have been something else entirely. I pushed the cabin door open, and it swung inward on hinges that should have rusted away decades ago but moved with the smooth silence of recent maintenance. Inside, the cabin's floor was carpeted with personal items that told the story of interrupted lives, a broken music box lying open, its tiny ballerina frozen mid-spin, a mother's locket with photographs of children who would never grow old, a child's doll with one button eye missing, staring up at me with its remaining eye in mute accusation. In the center of the cabin, 2 chairs faced each other in a tableau that spoke of eternal waiting. John's empty hat sat on one chair, a brown fedora that I remembered from the missing persons report. Emma's doll, a different one from the broken toy on the floor, perched on the other chair, its china face painted with an expression of patient expectation. The walls of the cabin were alive with more than just ivy. Photographs covered every available surface, but they weren't normal pictures. They showed the same scene over and over again, a family camping trip, a father and daughter by a campfire, moments of happiness frozen in time but somehow wrong, somehow corrupted. The photographs seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, faces turning to follow my movement, expressions changing from joy to desperation. I backed away from the chairs, but voices began to rise around me like a tide of whispered desperation. The air filled with the sound of fear, regret, and longing that had been building for 40 years. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with trapped emotion, pressing in on me as if the cabin was a living thing trying to digest me. My torch flickered, the beam growing weaker as if the very air was consuming the light. And then, in the cabin's single window, a face materialized, not reflected in the glass but somehow existing within it, pressed against the barrier between worlds like someone drowning behind ice. John Fowler looked exactly as he had in the photographs. A man in his 30s with kind eyes that now held 4 decades of trapped desperation. His hand pressed against the glass from the inside, and I could see his mouth moving, forming words that took me several seconds to understand. "Help us! Please! Help us get home!" The window glass felt ice-cold under my fingers as I lunged forward, grasping the frame with hands that shook from more than just the underground chill. John's face became clearer, more solid, as if my acknowledgement of his presence was allowing him to manifest more fully. His eyes met mine with an intensity that spoke of desperation beyond human endurance. I yanked at the window frame, and it opened with a shriek of protesting wood and metal. The sound echoed through the chamber like the cry of something in mortal agony. The moment the window opened, wind roared in from somewhere that couldn't exist, a gale that carried the scent of pine trees and campfire smoke, of Esmores and childhood summers, but underneath it all, the unmistakable smell of decay. My torch guttered and died, plunging me into a darkness so complete it felt solid, pressing against my eyes like velvet. I fumbled desperately in my pockets for matches, my fingers clumsy with cold and terror. In the absolute blackness, I could hear Emma's small voice calling my name, and John's deeper tones joining her in a chorus of need that pulled at my heart. The match flared to life with a hiss, and in its brief, dancing light, I saw them all. Emma stood beside me, no longer confined to the pool, her small hand reaching for mine with fingers that felt real and warm and desperately alive. John stepped through the impossible window, moving with the careful gait of someone who had been trapped in one position for too long. But they weren't alone. The match light revealed dozens of pale figures surrounding us in the cabin that had somehow expanded to accommodate them all. Men, women, children, all the missing persons whose names I'd seen carved into the corridor walls. They drifted closer with movements that weren't quite walking, their mouths open in silent screams that spoke of decades of accumulated anguish. They reached toward me with hands that passed through the match flame without being burned, their eyes reflecting the tiny light with the intensity of people drowning who suddenly see a lifeline. Each face was frozen at the moment of their disappearance, some young, some old, all trapped in the eternal present of their vanishing. The match died, and in the returning darkness, their voices rose in a crescendo of pleading that threatened to overwhelm my sanity. "Don't leave us! Help us! Take us home! Please! Please! Please!" Panic surged through me like electricity, and I swung the bloodied shovel I still clutched in my free hand. The tool passed through empty air, but the cathedral of shadows recoiled as if struck, giving me the space I needed to flee. I lit another match, seeing the path back to the corridor, back to the stairs, back to the world of the living. I bolted past the rocking chairs, which had begun to move on their own, creaking back and forth in a rhythm that matched no earthly heartbeat. Up the moss-slick stairs I ran, taking them 2 at a time despite the danger of falling. Behind me, Emma and John's voices followed, not threatening but pleading with the desperation of children afraid of being left alone in the dark. "Don't leave us," Emma called, her voice growing fainter but no less heartbreaking. "We've been waiting so long. Please," John's voice echoed up from the depths. "We just want to go home." But I couldn't stop, couldn't turn back. Couldn't risk becoming another name carved into those stone walls. Branches tore at my jacket as I burst from the cellar into the forest above, roots seemed to reach up from the ground to trip me, and behind me, the very air seemed to thicken and pull, trying to drag me back into the underground prison. I ran through the night forest with the speed of pure terror, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over fallen logs, my lungs burning with each ragged breath. The beam of my drop torch was long gone, leaving me to navigate by starlight and desperate memory, following the faint trail markers back towards civilization and safety. Morning found me collapsed on the ranger station's front steps, soaked through with dew and sweat and shaking so violently I could barely hold the radio to call for backup. In my hand, clutched so tightly my knuckles had gone white, was Emma's doll, the one that had been sitting on the chair in the impossible cabin. I had no memory of picking it up, no recollection of bringing it with me in my desperate flight, but there it was, solid and real and somehow warm despite the cold morning air. "Jackson Base, this is Ranger Ellis." I spoke into the radio with a voice that cracked from exhaustion and something deeper. "I have evidence. I have proof." The response was predictably skeptical. "Hallucinations brought on by stress and isolation," they said. "Sleep deprivation and an overactive imagination." The official report would note that I had suffered a psychological breakdown while investigating reports of missing campers, that I had been found in a state of extreme distress with no clear explanation for my condition. But I had the photographs, dozens of them, taken automatically by my radio's emergency beacon when it had activated during my underground ordeal. The images showed the corridor of names, the impossible cabin, the faces in the walls. They showed Emma standing in the pool, and John's desperate expression pressed against the glass. Most importantly, they showed the entrance to the underground complex, coordinates logged automatically by GPS. The search and rescue team that followed my directions found the cellar door exactly where I said it would be. They found the blood-stained shovel and the hand-drawn map. They found the corridor carved with names, though several of the team members reported feeling dizzy and disoriented while underground, and 2 refused to continue after the first chamber. They found the names carved in stone, each one corresponding to unsolved missing persons cases dating back over a century. The Lost Cabin Trail, it seemed, had been claiming victims long before the Fowlers disappeared, long before the park was officially established. The trail itself was apparently a kind of trap, drawing the lost and the searching deeper into something that had been waiting in the darkness for far longer than anyone had imagined. But they didn't find Emma or John, and they couldn't explain the cabin that appeared in my photographs. The official investigation concluded that the underground complex was a natural cave system that had been used by various individuals over the years, possibly as shelter or for ritualistic purposes. The names on the walls were dismissed as graffiti, despite carbon dating that proved some of them had been carved decades before the missing persons they commemorated had even been born. Emma's doll sits on my desk now, in my new office 3 states away where I transferred as soon as the investigation was closed. It serves as a reminder that some spirits linger when their stories go untold, when their disappearances become nothing more than cold case files gathering dust in forgotten cabinets. Sometimes, late at night when I'm working alone, I hear that music box melody drifting through the building's ventilation system. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," played in a minor key that makes my soul ache with sympathetic sorrow. And sometimes I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, a small figure in a blue dress with white flowers, or a man in a brown fedora standing just at the edge of sight. They're not threatening. They're not trying to frighten me. They're simply waiting, with the infinite patience of those who exist outside of time, for someone to finish what I started. Someone brave enough or foolish enough to return to that place beneath the earth, and find a way to lead them home. The Lost Cabin Trail sign was removed by Park Services, the area cordoned off and marked as dangerous due to unstable geological conditions. But I know that won't stop it. Somewhere out there, probably right now, another hiker is finding that sign half buried in mud and ivy, following its weathered arrow into the darkness, drawn by the same inexplicable compulsion that leads moths to flame. And when they do, Emma and John will be waiting, along with all the others whose names are carved in stone, hoping that this time, someone will be strong enough to break the cycle and guide them back to the light they lost so many years ago. The doll's remaining button eye seems to watch me as I write these words, and sometimes I swear I can hear Emma's voice, faint as a whisper but clear as crystal. "Come back, Ranger. Please come back. We're still waiting." I know I should ignore it. I know I should let sleeping spirits lie and trust that time will eventually heal even these ancient wounds. But late at night, when the wind carries the scent of pine trees and distant campfires, I find myself planning a return trip, mapping the route back to that forgotten corner of Pine Ridge Park where the impossible becomes inevitable, and the missing never truly disappear. Because some promises, once made, can never be broken. And somewhere in the darkness beneath the earth, Emma Fowler is still waiting for someone to keep theirs. I'd patrolled Oak Hollow Park for 5 years without incident. 5 years of listening to the forest breathe. Every rustling leaf was a field mouse darting through the undergrowth. Every snap of a twig was a deer stepping cautiously in the dark. I knew the hoot of the great horned owl, the distant yip of coyotes, the whisper of the wind through the ponderosa pines. It all fit the natural, predictable soundtrack of the woods. Until tonight. Tonight I heard footsteps that didn't belong to any living creature I knew. It was 2 hours past midnight, deep into the graveyard shift. A coming storm had swallowed the moon whole, leaving the park in an oppressive, inky blackness. The air was thick and heavy, charged with unspoken energy. All I had was the narrow, bouncing beam of my flashlight and the intermittent, reassuring hum of my radio. My name is Ranger Torres, and I've stood my ground against 200-pound black bears and navigated the deadly chaos of flash floods. But I have never felt a dread like this, a cold dread that seemed to seep into my bones from the damp earth itself. The footsteps were soft at first, almost dismissible. A faint, hesitant shuffle, like someone tiptoeing with unnatural care over the carpet of fallen pine cones and damp leaves. But they didn't fade. Instead, they grew louder, more deliberate, their rhythm unnervingly steady. They were circling my position, a predator evaluating its prey. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my knuckles white. The beam, my only anchor to the sane world, trembled across the moss-covered trail, making the shadows dance and twist into monstrous shapes. My pulse throbbed in my ears, a frantic drum against the sudden, watchful silence of the woods. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, its gait was wrong. It was too light for a man, yet too heavy for any animal. It wasn't human. A distant howl split the silence. It wasn't the sharp call of a coyote or the territorial cry of a wolf. This was a long, mournful wail that vibrated through the air and settled deep in my chest, a sound of profound loss. The hair on my neck and arms prickled, standing on end. My radio, clipped to my shoulder, crackled to life, the burst of static making me jump. "Torres, you copy?" It was bass, the voice of my dispatcher, a lifeline from a world that suddenly felt miles away. "All quiet here," I lied. My voice was a stranger's, somehow steadier than I felt, a hollow echo in the charged air. No one needed to know my hands were shaking. No one needed to know I was no longer alone. Admitting it would make it real, and my sanity was clinging to the hope that this was just fatigue, my mind playing tricks on me in the suffocating darkness. I took a single, deliberate step forward, every nerve alight, every muscle coiled tight. The beam of my flashlight caught a flicker of movement high on a hill ridge overlooking the trail. Just for a second, a bolt of lightning spiderwebbed across the clouds, backlighting a tall, slender figure standing impossibly still. It vanished before my eyes could properly focus, before my brain could process the shape, leaving only the searing afterimage against the black. The echo of wet, heavy footprints, leading off the main trail into the untamed woods, was all that remained. My breath caught in my throat, a painful, sharp gasp. I swallowed against the dryness in my mouth. Then, the footsteps resumed, closer now, impossibly closer. But they were coming from my 6 o'clock. Behind me. In that moment, the thin veil of denial was shredded. This was no routine patrol. This was a violation. I pressed the transmit button on my radio, my whisper barely audible above the rising wind. "I've got something. I'm following." Rain began to patter against the leaves, a slow, ominous rhythm like a drumbeat counting down my final seconds. With each step I took off the trail and into the abyss, the familiar forest receded, replaced by a world of looming shadows and sibilant whispers that seemed to carry my name on the wind. The muddy path, barely a trail at all, wound steeply downhill toward Ranger Station 2. This was my intended shelter, a small, solitary outpost against the wilderness. Now it felt like a desperate gamble. My flashlight cut a nervous, bouncing cone through the suffocating blackness, illuminating a world of dripping leaves and slick, treacherous roots that seemed to grab at my ankles. Each snap of a branch in the periphery made me flinch, my head whipping around, expecting to see a face in the dark. I checked my watch, its faint green glow a small comfort, 12:17 a.m. My shift was nearly over. A lifetime away. If I made it back. Then the sound stopped. Not just the footsteps, but everything. The wind died. The patter of rain ceased. The nocturnal insects fell silent. The silence was absolute, a physical blow that slammed into me, sucking the air from my lungs and leaving a ringing in my ears. It was the most unnatural thing I'd ever experienced. The forest was never truly quiet. I crouched low, instinctively trying to make myself a smaller target, aiming my beam down the empty trail. Nothing but mud and glistening leaves. I slowly stood, every muscle screaming in protest, and heard the sharp crunch of gravel directly behind me. On the path I had just walked. I spun, my service pistol already in my hand, the practice motion a cold comfort. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Federal Ranger! Show yourself!" My voice was swallowed by the void. No one was there. Just a mist, thick as smoke, swirling lazily between the gnarled, ancient trunks of the oaks. It was toying with me. Panic gave way to a surge of adrenaline. I dashed forward, my lungs burning, sucking in the thick, damp air. The station lights glowed faintly in the distance, a hazy, indistinct promise of safety through the thickening fog. Then another flash of lightning tore across the sky, and the world was bleached white for a split second. The silhouette was there again, impossibly close now, only 50 yards ahead, standing at the edge of the clearing where the station stood. It was the unmistakable shape of a ranger. A standard-issue uniform hung limp on a gaunt figure, its face completely obscured by the wide brim of a soaked campaign hat. My stomach lurched, a knot of ice and acid. "Stop! Hold it right there!" I shouted, my voice cracking, a pathetic sound against the brewing storm. The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch. It just stood there, a silent sentinel barring my way to safety. I sprinted the last stretch, desperation propelling me forward. My boots sank deep into the sucking mud, slowing my charge. I finally skidded to a halt just a few feet away, panting, my gun still raised with trembling hands. Slowly, deliberately, the figure turned. Its head tilted down, as if in a gesture of morbid courtesy. The brim of the hat angled upwards, revealing what lay in the shadows beneath. There was no face. Only empty, black eye sockets set in an expressionless, weather-beaten skull. A jawbone hung slack, a silent, cavernous O of blackness. I froze, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. The crack of thunder directly overhead was so violent it shook the ground beneath my feet. In that deafening moment, the Phantom Ranger lifted a skeletal hand, its bony finger unnervingly steady as it pointed away from the station, back toward the dark, oppressive woods from which I had just fled. It was a clear, silent command. I swallowed, the sound loud in the ensuing silence. My voice was a ragged catch in my throat. Who are you?" There was no answer. Only the sharp hiss of the returning rain striking the metal of my gun barrel. And then, as if it were nothing more than smoke, the phantom melted into the swirling mist, dissolving from the ground up until nothing was left. Nothing, except for a single object lying half buried in the mud where it had stood. A rusted, old-fashioned ranger's badge. Badge number 47. My blood ran cold. I knew that number. Every ranger at Oak Hollow heard the stories, the cautionary tales whispered to rookies. Ranger Perez. Missing, presumed fallen, during the great storm of '82. My fingers trembled uncontrollably as I knelt and picked it up. It was cold, unnaturally so, a piece of ice against my skin. A sense of dreadful, undeniable duty surged through me, overriding the terror. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a message. I had to know why he remained here, a sentinel of bone and shadow, forever haunting these trails. I clipped the badge to my belt, the cold metal seeming to burn through the fabric. But as I rose, a new horror unfolded. The station lights, my beacon of hope, flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the entire clearing into absolute, impenetrable darkness. I was alone, truly alone, trapped in a storm with the restless dead. I fumbled for my radio, my fingers slick with rain and sweat. I thumbed the transmit button. "Base, this is Torres. Do you copy? The power is out at Station 2. I need static." A harsh, deafening roar of it. The storm must have finally knocked out the repeater on the mountain. No backup was coming. No voice of reason would cut through this nightmare. I had only one option left. The one he had given me. Clutching the cold, heavy badge in my hand, I turned away from the dead sanctuary of the station and plunged back into the blackness of the woods, following the direction his skeletal finger had pointed. My pulse throbbed in my head, a frantic, desperate rhythm. The trees loomed like ancient, skeletal sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. The rain hammered against my hat, a relentless assault. Every step was an act of faith and madness, and I half expected that empty skull to materialize at my side, guiding me deeper into his domain. Then I heard it. A sound that defied all logic and chilled me far more than the phantom's appearance. Laughter. It was distant at first, a harsh, metallic, scraping sound, like rusted gears grinding together. It echoed through the trees, a sound of pure mockery that no human throat could ever produce. The laughter circled me, seeming to come from all directions at once, twisting and warping in the storm until it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. I stood frozen, the wind whipping tears from my eyes, and I finally understood. I wasn't in Oak Hollow Park anymore. I was in his world now, the world between life and death, and I was playing by its rules. The horrifying laughter eventually faded, dissolving into the rhythmic, almost soothing drip of water. The storm's fury seemed to lessen here, as if I had passed through a veil into a place of profound quiet and sorrow. I found myself standing before an old, wrought-iron gate, its black paint peeling to reveal rust beneath. A weathered wooden sign hung crookedly from one hinge, the carved words faint but legible. "Cemetery of the Fallen Rangers." My stomach knotted into a tight, painful ball. I'd read about this place in the dusty park archives, a footnote in a forgotten history ledger. A secret, unconsecrated resting ground for rangers and park personnel lost in the line of duty, their bodies never recovered from the vast wilderness. It was considered a myth, a ghost story. The gate was ajar, a silent invitation. With a deep, trembling breath, I pushed through. Inside, the air was still and cold. Gravestones, hundreds of them, jutted from the damp earth at odd, unsettling angles, as if trying to escape. Their names were worn away by decades of wind and rain. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene, and for a heart-stopping second, I saw the true scale of the place, a silent, forgotten army sleeping beneath my feet. Ranger Perez's stone was right in front, larger than the others, a clear centerpiece. The lightning etched his name and date of death into my vision, October 31st, 1982. Beneath it, an engraved message. "Duty calls even beyond the grave." My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird. I reached out a hesitant hand and touched the cold, damp stone. A shock, frigid and electric, shot up my arm, making my teeth chatter. Suddenly, the ground beneath me trembled, a low, guttural moan rising from the earth itself. The sound of cracking stone echoed all around me. I watched in abject horror as the gravestones shuddered, and from the saturated soil beside them, pale, skeletal hands clawed their way into the night. One by one they rose. Uniformed figures, their ranger greens tattered and stained with grave dirt, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollow, bottomless pits of shadow. They rose in utter silence, a legion of the lost, turning as one to face me. The air grew thick with the cloying reek of damp earth, decay, and forgotten memories. I stumbled backward, my feet tangling in the overgrown grass. I'm sorry," I stammered, the words absurd. "I didn't mean to disturb you." They responded in unison, their heads tilting at an unnatural angle, their mouths stretching open in silent, agonizing screams that I felt rather than heard. Then, the phantom of Ranger Perez appeared, coalescing from the mist behind them, his own badge gleaming faintly in the intermittent flashes of lightning. He raised his skeletal hand again, not with menace, but with purpose, pointing past the ranks of the dead to a large, moss-covered mausoleum door half hidden by weeping willows at the far edge of the cemetery. I knew this was no longer a rescue or a recovery. This was a ritual, and I was its unwilling participant. But I couldn't turn back. Not after finding his badge. Not after entering his realm. My terror was now mingled with a grim resolve. Taking a shaky step, and then another, I walked through the silent, watching ranks of the dead, towards the mausoleum door. The heavy stone door of the mausoleum groaned in protest as I pushed it open, the sound echoing down the narrow hallway within. The interior was lit by a series of flickering sconces, their flames casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. As I walked forward, each flame I passed sputtered and died, plunging the corridor behind me into absolute darkness, as if my living presence was anathema to this place. The walls were carved with names, dates, and ranger insignias, a final, grim testament to the men buried outside. At the far end of the hall stood a simple stone dais. Atop it lay a single object, a ranger's field diary, its leather binding cracked and warped by time and damp. Perez's name was embossed in faded gold on the cover. I approached the dais, my boots echoing in the sudden silence. With hands that shook so badly I could barely control them, I reached out and opened the book. The pages were filled with Perez's tight, frantic scrawl. They detailed his final shift, the same night as the great storm of '82. He wrote of an encounter with a malevolent presence in the woods, something ancient and hungry that the storm had awakened. He'd been torn between saving a group of lost campers and obeying a direct park protocol to fall back. His last entry was barely legible, the pen strokes digging into the paper. The storm never ends. It is a part of it. A part of him. The campers are gone. I heard them screaming. He took them. Now they call to me. Their voices, they call me back to the woods. I have to join them in the silence. It is my duty to watch. Sorry, old friend. Whoever you are. If you find this, you must end it. Don't let him keep us here. Burn it all. A blast of impossibly cold wind roared down the hallway, extinguishing the final sconce and plunging me into pitch blackness. I fumbled for my flashlight. Its switch clicked uselessly. Dead. My radio was still silent. My heart hammered against my chest, a wild, frantic beat in the suffocating dark. Then a guttural voice echoed from the very stones around me, a layered chorus of whispers and moans. Join us. Duty calls. The walls began to drip with a cold, slick condensation. I felt icy, impossibly strong hands grasp my shoulders, their grip like stone, pulling me down, trying to drag me into the floor itself. I wrenched free with a scream, clutching the diary to my chest. I turned and sprinted back through the lightless hallway, guided only by memory. The whispers crescendoed into a symphony of anguished screams that tore at my sanity. Outside, I could hear the heavy, percussive sound of gravestones slamming shut, sealing the dead back in the earth. Lightning cracked directly overhead as I burst from the mausoleum, gasping, back into the raging storm, the diary pressed hard against my chest. I raced through the cemetery, towards the faint outline of the trees that marked the way back to Station 2. But as I broke through the tree-line, I skidded to a halt. The Phantom Patrol was there, standing in perfect, silent formation before me, blocking my path. Their faces were blank, their hollow eye sockets fixed on me. As I watched, paralyzed, they raised their heads in perfect, chilling unison, their skulls shining wetly in the lightning. Ranger Perez emerged from the mist to stand at their front. My breath ripped from my lungs in a ragged sob. He didn't point. He didn't threaten. He simply extended his skeletal hand, not toward me, but toward the old fire pit behind the station. Then he looked from the fire pit to the diary I clutched in my hand. The meaning was absolute, a silent, desperate plea. I had to burn it. Without the written words that chronicled their torment, The curse that bound him and his men to these woods could finally be broken. My legs, acting on their own accord, carried me to the fire pit behind Station 2. My hands, though still trembling, worked with a newfound purpose. I piled the dry logs that were kept under a small lean-to, my movements methodical, automatic. I placed Perez's diary atop the pyre. Across the clearing, the phantom patrol watched from the tree-lean, their forms wavering in the storm, silent and patient at last. I struck a match. The tiny flame sputtered, almost dying in the wind and rain, but it caught the corner of the cracked leather. The cover began to curl and blacken. A low moan, not of anguish but of release, seemed to rise from the watching patrol. The wind roared, whipping the flames into a frenzy, and the diary burned with an unnatural speed. The pages curled inward, the frantic words of Ranger Perez turning to glowing embers and then to black ash. The smoke did not scatter. Instead, it twisted into a thick, cohesive column, rising straight into the stormy sky. For a fleeting second, I saw a shape within it, a hand, raised not in threat, but in a gesture of final, grateful salute. When the very last page had turned to ash and drifted away on the wind, the storm broke. The torrential rain ceased as if a tap had been turned off. The wind died down to a gentle sigh. A profound calm settled over Oak Hollow Park, and for the first time that night, I heard the familiar, comforting sounds of the forest returning. In the dying embers, I saw only the charred logs of an empty fire pit. I looked to the tree-lean. There was no patrol, no phantom, just the quiet, peaceful whisper of the wind through the pines. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the eastern sky in hues of gray and soft pink. I walked back to the cemetery, a place that no map would ever show. I left the rusted badge, number 47, resting gently on the ground where Perez's gravestone once stood. No one at base would ever believe the story of the Phantom Patrol. It would be dismissed as a stress-induced hallucination, a trick of the storm and an overactive imagination. But I know what I saw. I know what I did. Now every midnight I patrol the trails of Oak Hollow with a new, solemn purpose. Not just as a guardian of the living, but as a watchman for those who continue to serve, forever silent, beyond the veil.